Stefon Diggs just wrapped up his first few days with the Washington Commanders, and he's already speaking out about what he's seen. From playing alongside Terry McLaurin to calling Jaden Daniels a superstar, Diggs had plenty to say, but one comment about his own role really stood out. Stefon Diggs signed with the Washington Commanders this week, and within hours he was on the practice field wearing burgundy and gold for the first time in his career. This wasn't a trade, this wasn't a rumor that dragged on for months. It happened fast, a deal, a physical, a signature, and then Diggs jogging out for team drills less than 48 hours after the ink dried. The move gave Washington's offense something it had been missing all training camp, a real answer opposite Terry McLaurin. The Washington Commanders had one big question on offense: who would be the number 2 receiver? They answered it Wednesday, it's Stefon Diggs. The Commanders signed him to a 1-year deal worth up to $12 million. That number matters. It tells you exactly how the front office viewed him, not as a reclamation project, not as a flyer, but as a difference maker they were willing to pay real money for on short notice. And Diggs didn't waste any time saying what this meant to him. Speaking to reporters after his first practice, he made it clear this wasn't just another stop on a well-traveled career. For the first decade of his NFL career, Stefon Diggs always felt like he had something to prove when going up against Washington. "That's my hometown team, them and the Baltimore Ravens," Diggs said. Then he went further, and this is where his voice cracked with something you don't usually hear from a guy who's spent 11 years bouncing between AFC and NFC contenders. "I always played with a chip on my shoulder, but the chip got really big when I'd go home because I felt like they passed up on me, didn't give me a chance, and I was right in their backyard." Let that sink in for a second. This is a guy who grew up in Gaithersburg, Maryland, practically in the shadow of this franchise, and got skipped over completely. Washington and every NFL franchise passed on Diggs multiple times in the 2015 draft, before Minnesota selected him in the 5th round. 5th round, not a household name coming out, not a guy anybody circled as a future 4-time Pro Bowler. Just a kid from down the road that his own hometown team didn't want. So when Diggs stood at that podium this week, the emotion wasn't manufactured. "I got chills just now. I can't write a better story," Diggs said. He kept going, laying out exactly why the timing of this signing hit him the way it did. "At this point in my career, with what I want to do, being able to be healthy, coming off an ACL and having success, and then coming to your hometown team and wanting to shine for them. I want to put on for my city. I wanted to do that when I was away, and I want to do that when I'm home." That's the headline, that's the moment the cameras caught. But if you only watched the clip that made the rounds online, you missed how much more he actually said about the team he's walking into, about the quarterback he's catching passes from now, and about a version of himself that teammates in 2 other cities weren't always sure they were getting. Because here's the thing about Stefon Diggs, he doesn't do quiet arrivals. He's never been the guy to slip into a new building and let his play speak entirely for itself. He talks, he states his case, and on day 1 in Ashburn, Virginia, he did exactly that. Not just about the city, but about his own game, his new teammates, and where he thinks he still ranks among the best receivers alive. Head coach Dan Quinn was asked directly why the team felt comfortable bringing in a guy who's had his share of drama across 3 different franchises. His answer wasn't hedged. Quinn confirmed that the reports around Diggs' character were enough to take the plunge. That's a coach publicly vouching for a player's makeup before he's played a single preseason snap for the team. It tells you Quinn had done his homework, talked to people who'd coached him, played with him, dealt with him in meeting rooms, and came away convinced. Diggs' first practice reflected that same energy. He wasn't asked to do a full workload. Although Diggs didn't do much during his first day, that was by design. As head coach Dan Quinn said, the Commanders would ramp him up over the next few days. He was full of energy on the practice field. Reporters and teammates watching from the sideline noticed it immediately. He was dancing between reps and getting to know his new teammates, with a spring in his step as he went between drills. Even in limited reps, the tape matched the hype. He lived up to the hype in his limited reps, running efficient routes, and showing off quick hands during individual drills. That's the scene. A guy who wasn't wanted by this franchise a decade ago, now dancing through drills on their practice field, telling reporters he's got chills. But the real substance of what Diggs said after that practice, the parts that reveal exactly how he sees his role, his new quarterback, and his own standing in the league. That's where this story actually gets interesting. And it starts with a question nobody expected him to answer so directly. Is he really okay being someone's number 2? Here's where Diggs' first days in Washington got complicated in the best possible way. Because for most of his career, Stefon Diggs has been the guy, the number 1. the focal point of whatever offense he's playing in. Now at 32, he's walking into a room where Terry McLaurin is unquestionably the top receiver, and Diggs is, on paper, the number 2. He addressed that dynamic head-on, and it revealed exactly how much competitive fire he's still carrying into this new chapter. Reporters brought up something Diggs had said publicly back in July, months before this signing was even finalized. On his own YouTube channel, he'd made a case that stuck with people. "Everybody got a 1, Diggs said in a video on his YouTube channel in July. "Opportunities aside, people might say there's 7 real 1s. In my opinion, I can compete with anybody, but take those as your 1s. He kept pushing that point, daring anyone to name a receiver clearly ahead of him in a number 2 role. "You can't name a number 2 better than me. Name your number 2 receiver right now." So when he got to Washington, that same swagger showed up at the podium, except now he had to clean it up a little in front of a national audience. New Washington Commanders wideout Stefon Diggs recently said he would be the best number 2 wide receiver in the NFL this season. On Friday, he said that wasn't quite accurate, and then he explained the distinction in a way that was honestly pretty clever. "I say 2 on camera," he said, "but in my heart I'm going to say best number 1. Reporters pressed on whether that kind of talk was going to ruffle feathers in a receiver room that already has an established star. Diggs made sure to frame it the right way. He said he meant his comments humbly and wasn't trying to be abrasive. It's a fine line he's walking, confident enough to say he still thinks he's elite, careful enough not to step on McLaurin's toes before he's even played a game for the team. And that walk matters, because this is now the 3rd team Diggs has changed in 3 years. Diggs has changed teams for the 3rd time in 3 years, but that hasn't dented his confidence. Buffalo, Houston, New England, now Washington. Most players who bounce that much start sounding worn down, cautious, grateful just to have a locker. Diggs sounds like a guy who still thinks he's the best receiver in whatever room he walks into. He's just gotten smarter about how he phrases it publicly. What's notable is how he talked about McLaurin specifically, because this is the guy he's sharing targets with now, and the early word from inside the building is that there's real mutual respect building fast. Diggs admitted the two didn't have any kind of relationship before he arrived, but he'd clearly been watching from a distance for years. He called McLaurin's game real similar to myself, which, from a guy who rarely hands out comparisons to his own game, is about as strong a compliment as it gets. He didn't stop at McLaurin either. Diggs used his first media session to run down the entire room, naming teammates one by one, like he was already building the offense in his head. He called quarterback Jaden Daniels a superstar without hesitation. Then he turned to the receiver room itself, and this is where things got specific. He singled out rookie Antonio Williams as a player who immediately jumped out at him on tape and in person, and brought up tight end Chigakonkwo by name too, saying the pieces around him meant defenses were going to have a hard time deciding who to take away. His exact words painted a picture of an offense that scares him in a good way, not one he needs to save single-handedly. He said it would be hard to double anybody in that scheme, pointing out that between the mobile quarterback, the playmakers who can work out of the backfield, and the receivers who can win one-on-one, there just aren't enough defenders to go around. That's a different tone than the guy who spent July insisting nobody could touch him as a number 2. This is a guy who arrived at his first practice, looked around the room, and started plotting how all these pieces fit together with him in the middle of it, sure, but not as the lone engine. Quinn picked up on that shift immediately, and it changed how the coaching staff talked about him internally within days of his arrival. Quinn admitted he'd played against Diggs plenty of times over the years and always respected the tape, but what caught him off guard wasn't the roots or the hands, it was the willingness to lead that showed up on day one, with Diggs spending extra time after practice with Daniels, with McLaurin, and with a group of younger players on both sides of the ball who probably never expected a veteran of his stature to seek them out unprompted. Diggs talked about that instinct too, and it's worth hearing in his own framing, because it's not the caricature people built of him during his rockier years elsewhere. He said he always tries to push the guys around him to be the best versions of themselves, and that the locker room culture was already forming just one day in. He described more conversations with new teammates than he expected to have on a first day. Guys walking up to him unprompted, wanting to talk, wanting to learn. That's the part of Diggs' first days that didn't make every headline, but it's the part that tells you the most about where his head is right now. He's not walking into Washington trying to prove he's still the best receiver on the planet. He's walking in trying to prove something closer to home. Literally. Which brings up the obvious question hanging over all of this. Why is a guy with 4 Pro Bowl nods and a top 5 reception rate in the entire league settling for a 1-year deal worth up to $12 million? To understand that, you have to go back to what happened to Diggs before Washington ever came calling. The injury, the trade, the disappointing year in New England. Because his first days as a Commander don't make sense without knowing what he just climbed out of. To understand why Diggs sounded the way he did at that podium, chills, gratitude. A guy practically pinching himself, you have to go back roughly 2 years, to a moment that nearly derailed everything. Diggs was traded to the Houston Texans and started strong, putting together the kind of numbers that reminded everyone why he'd been worth a first-round pick in a trade years earlier. Diggs spent the 2024 season with the Houston Texans after being traded from the Buffalo Bills. In his 8 appearances before his injury, he recorded 47 catches for 496 yards and 3 touchdowns, along with his first career rushing touchdown. Then, midway through that season, everything stopped. A torn ACL limited him to 8 games in 2024, his first major injury in a career that had otherwise been remarkably durable. He later admitted just how heavy that stretch was on him mentally, in a way that went beyond the physical rehab. His torn ACL, his first major injury in the NFL, had challenged him in ways he never had been before. He acknowledged it was one of the hardest things he has ever experienced, saying, "I was in like a real dark space for a little while." That's not the language of a guy putting on a brave face for cameras. That's someone who genuinely didn't know, for a stretch, whether he'd get back to the level he'd built his entire identity around. The Texans made the playoffs that year without him at full strength, but the injury effectively ended his run there. The Texans went just 4-5 after Diggs' injury. While they still managed to make the playoffs and even won a playoff game, the Texans just didn't have enough juice to take down the Kansas City Chiefs. He hit free agency needing to convince an entire league that a 31-year-old receiver could come back from a torn ACL and still be a #1 option. New England took that bet and they didn't hedge on it. A Patriots team in desperate need of established pass catchers brushed aside concerns over Diggs' age and injury, handing him a 3-year, $63.5 million contract. That's a serious financial commitment for a player coming off the exact kind of injury that ends receivers' primes. But the rehab reports were encouraging almost immediately. Diggs was ahead of schedule in his rehab, running at full speed while cutting and changing direction with his legs during workouts. The 31-year-old wide receiver has been one of the best players at his position since the turn of the decade. Even so, there was real uncertainty about whether he'd be ready for the start of the season, and Diggs himself wasn't sugarcoating it. He told reporters he didn't know how he felt about week 1, that coaches weren't too excited and he wasn't too excited, and that it looked like nobody quite knew where things were going to go. But just days later, his tone shifted to something far more confident. "I got a scoop for you. I'm back. There it is. I'm back strapping them up," Diggs said confidently. He did suit up for the opener, and the moment carried weight beyond the box score. When Diggs sprinted onto the field before kickoff, he made his way to the back left pylon of the far end zone, dropping to his knee to reflect, with a lot going through his mind before his first game back after the injury. "I took a little moment to be grateful and kind of bask in the ambiance of where I was, back doing what I love," he explained. The stat line that day was modest but real. He finished the season-opening loss to the Raiders with 6 catches on 7 targets for 57 yards, playing 48% of New England's offensive snaps. Afterward, he didn't try to hide how much simply being out there again meant to him. "I had these moments where I was like, damn, I missed this so much, and I'm so thankful to be back around what I love to do," Diggs added. For a stretch of that season, the recovery story looked like a triumph. Several weeks in, he was putting together the kind of numbers that suggested the knee wasn't a limiting factor at all. Diggs looked no worse for wear since getting the green light for snaps at the start of the 2025 season, reeling in 39 catches for 456 yards across 7 games. His own description of his approach that season was almost stripped down in its simplicity. "I'm going to do my job. My job is try to be open." But a down season is how Washington Post described his final numbers in New England. And that framing matters because it's the backdrop against which this Commander's deal has to be understood. Diggs is coming off a down season in New England, but he's been a #1 option most of his career. The knee held up, the production relative to his own standard, didn't fully return. And that's precisely why a four-time Pro Bowler with a resume like his ended up on a one-year deal, instead of the kind of long-term contract he might have commanded 3 years earlier. That's the piece that makes Diggs' words at his introductory press conference land differently. He wasn't just talking about coming home, he was talking about proving to himself as much as anyone that the player who nearly disappeared in a dark space during rehab was still capable of being someone's difference maker. Washington didn't just sign a receiver, they signed a guy trying to answer a question about his own career, on a stage with his own name attached to the city limits. So why did Washington move so fast? And why did they feel comfortable committing real money to a 32-year-old coming off a down year? The answer says as much about the team's roster gap as it does about Diggs himself. Going into training camp, the Commanders had a glaring hole. Outside of McLaurin, the next three options on Washington's depth chart entering camp were former first-round pick Treylon Burks, Luke McCaffrey and rookie Antonio Williams, a group with talent but no proven track record as a true second option. Even Washington's coaching staff and front office had been eyeing this gap for months. The Commanders had one big question on offense heading into camp: who would be the number 2 receiver? And that spot had remained a topic of conversation since they started practicing again in the spring. Behind the scenes, the urgency was even more specific than the public reporting suggested. One team source made clear this wasn't a case of Washington casually shopping the market. One team source said Diggs was the only free agent they were interested in signing at this time. They'd had a similar type of playmaker the year before but lost him. They had Deebo Samuel last season, but he's best used in the slot, and they drafted someone for that role who excites them in Williams. So Samuel wasn't an option before he signed with San Francisco. That left one clear name on the board, and general manager Adam Peters moved on it. The money made sense given the market. Analysts pointed out that comparable receivers were getting similar or larger deals elsewhere. Even with projected further decline given his age, Diggs is certainly a huge upgrade over Treylon Burks, Diami Brown, or Van Jefferson. At up to $12 million, he's easily worth it. Considering that, for example, Jalen Naylor signed a free agency deal for almost $12 million per year this offseason, that's a nice contract for Diggs. The structure of the deal itself tells its own story about risk. This wasn't a multi-year commitment betting on Diggs' long-term future. It's the definition of a low-risk, high-reward acquisition that will be a masterstroke if everything goes according to plan. 1 year, big incentives attached. If he's healthy and productive, both sides win. If the knee or the age catches up to him, Washington isn't locked into anything beyond this season. That structure also explains why Diggs was so motivated to sell himself at that first press conference. Every rep, every comment, every bit of energy on the practice field is building toward proving this deal should turn into something longer. He arrived on his own initiative before the ink was even fully dry, taking care of the physical process on the team's designated off day rather than waiting around. With the Commanders having an off day from practice on Thursday, one would expect Diggs to take part in his first practice on Friday. He didn't wait for a scheduled window. He showed up early, went through his physical, met people around the building, and by the next morning he was officially a Commander. That eagerness matched what coach Dan Quinn had been signaling since before the deal closed. Beyond just vouching for his character, Quinn laid out an actual plan for integrating Diggs without rushing him. A deliberate ramp-up designed to build him into full participation over several days rather than throwing him into the fire immediately. That patience is notable for a team that badly needed his production, but it reflects lessons learned from his own injury history. Nobody in that building wants to risk a setback by pushing him too hard, too early. There's also the matter of scheme fit, which multiple people inside the building flagged almost immediately. Stylistically, Diggs is an excellent fit opposite McLaurin, who is a more traditional X receiver. That's not a small detail. Offenses live and die on how receivers complement each other, whether they draw the same type of coverage, whether they create actual separation problems for a defense trying to decide who to double. Diggs' route running instincts and ability to win in the slot as well as outside gives Washington's offensive staff far more flexibility than they had with Burks or McCaffrey. And then there's the piece that ties directly back to what Diggs said about wanting to lead. His immediate focus is in the classroom, hoping to learn new offensive coordinator David Blau's system quickly. Throughout his career, Diggs has earned the reputation of helping elevate young quarterbacks. That reputation isn't just talk, his track record backs it up. A young quarterback in New England who took a major step forward with Diggs as his top target, and now a young quarterback in Washington who's already talking about how much he's learned from him after just a few days. Reports out of camp indicate Daniels has been paying close attention to exactly how Diggs operates. His savvy in reading coverages, his willingness to communicate on the field, and the standard he sets even in walkthrough reps. For a franchise banking its future on its young quarterback, having a receiver in the room who's already been through the process of helping elevate a passer to another level isn't just a scheme fit. It's an investment in Daniels' development that goes beyond anything that shows up in a highlight reel. That's the calculation Washington made. Not just a receiver to fill a stat sheet, but a veteran whose presence in meeting rooms and walkthroughs could speed up the development of the two most important pieces of their offensive future, their franchise quarterback and their leading receiver. Whether that bet pays off is still unwritten, but the early signs from the front office all the way down to the locker room suggest everyone involved believes they got exactly the player they were hoping for. So where does this leave Stefon Diggs standing at the start of a season that could define how his career gets remembered? The version of himself he brought to that podium was noticeably different from the version fans watched during his more turbulent years in Buffalo and Minnesota. Back then, sideline outbursts and trade rumors followed him from city to city. This time, he talked about gratitude eliminating entitlement, a phrase that stuck with people in that room because it didn't sound like a talking point. It sounded like a guy who'd sat with a torn ACL and a dark space long enough to come out the other side with a different perspective on what actually matters. He said as much himself, describing what this opportunity meant beyond just football. It definitely means a lot to me, pulling your heartstrings a little bit, but I know I've got a city behind me. I've got a support system here, and I know I have a lot of love here. I want to make people proud. That's not the language of a mercenary chasing one more paycheck. It's the language of someone who understands this might be his last real chance to write the ending he wants. In the city he grew up in, for the team that once looked past him, alongside a quarterback still building his own legacy. There's still a version of this story that ends quietly. He's 32, he's coming off a season that didn't match his career standard, playing on a knee that only fully tested itself for the first time last fall. One bad landing, one recurring injury, and this becomes a short, sentimental footnote rather than the redemption arc everyone in Ashburn is hoping for. But there's also a version where this works exactly the way Diggs described it at that podium, where the chip he's carried since being passed over in that draft finally gets put to use for the team that once overlooked him, where Jaden Daniels gets the kind of veteran influence that turns a good young quarterback into a great one, and where a receiver room that entered camp with real questions suddenly looks like one of the most complete units in the league. Nobody in Ashburn is promising that outcome yet. What they are promising is effort, energy, and a guy who showed up on an off day to sign his name before anyone even asked him to. Whatever version of this season plays out, Stefon Diggs made one thing clear in his first days as a Commander. He came home to give this city something real, not just a highlight reel and a goodbye. Whether that promise turns into a Pro Bowl caliber season or a short, quiet chapter, the next several months will decide it on the field, starting with whatever happens the first time Washington needs him in a moment that matters.